November 17th, 2023. In San Francisco, employees at OpenAI were approaching the end of what appeared to be an ordinary working week. Less than a year earlier, the company had released ChatGPT, bringing generative artificial intelligence to millions of people and turning OpenAI into one of the most closely watched technology companies in the world. Its chief executive, Sam Altman, had become one of the most recognizable figures in the rapidly growing industry, appearing at conferences, meeting political leaders, and representing the company publicly as it continued to expand. Then that Friday afternoon, OpenAI published a short announcement. Sam Altman had been removed as chief executive by the company's board of directors. Within days, employees would threaten to leave, negotiations would take place over the future of the company, and much of the board responsible for the decision would itself be replaced. Before the week was over, Sam Altman would be back. In the early 2000s, artificial intelligence was already an important field of computer science, but most of its development remained largely invisible to the general public. Universities and technology companies were making rapid progress in machine learning, while improvements in computing power and the availability of large quantities of digital data allowed researchers to build increasingly capable systems. Companies including Google, Facebook, and Microsoft invested heavily in the field, competing for researchers and developing increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence laboratories. It was within this environment that OpenAI was established in San Francisco in 2015. Unlike a conventional technology startup, OpenAI was created as a nonprofit research organization. Its stated purpose was not simply to develop commercially successful software, but to ensure that increasingly capable artificial intelligence would ultimately benefit humanity. Among the people involved in its creation were technology entrepreneurs and researchers, including Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Greg Brockman, Ilya Sutskever, and others. Over the following years, however, developing increasingly powerful artificial intelligence systems required enormous amounts of computing infrastructure, specialized hardware, and capital. In 2019, OpenAI introduced a new organizational structure that allowed it to raise investment while preserving control by the original nonprofit. This arrangement was unusual. Investors could provide capital to the commercial operation, employees could receive equity-like economic interests, and the company could pursue products capable of generating substantial revenue. But ultimate governance remained with the nonprofit organization and its board. As OpenAI's technology improved, the organization gradually moved beyond research demonstrations and began releasing products that could be used by the public. Then, in November 2022, it released ChatGPT. The service rapidly introduced millions of ordinary users to generative artificial intelligence and transformed OpenAI from a research organization known largely within the technology industry into a company recognized around the world. As its products became more capable, the amount of money and infrastructure surrounding the organization also increased. But one important feature remained largely unchanged. Despite its growing commercial importance, OpenAI was still ultimately governed through a structure designed around the mission of a nonprofit organization. That structure would become particularly important in November 2023. On Friday, November 17th, 2023, OpenAI's board of directors announced that Sam Altman had been removed as chief executive. The announcement came with little warning. Mira Murati, the company's chief technology officer, was appointed interim CEO while the board began searching for a permanent replacement. In its public statement, the board said that Altman had not been consistently candid in his communications with its members, and that this had prevented them from properly carrying out their responsibilities. The statement provided few additional details. It did not identify a specific incident, nor did it explain exactly what information Altman had allegedly failed to communicate. At the same time, Greg Brockman, OpenAI's president and one of its co-founders, was removed as chairman of the board. although the company initially said he would remain in his operational role. Within hours, Brockman announced that he was leaving the company. The decision immediately raised questions both inside and outside OpenAI. Only 11 days earlier, Altman had appeared on stage at the company's first developer conference in San Francisco, presenting new products and discussing OpenAI's future. There had been little public indication that his position was under immediate threat. Microsoft, which had invested heavily in OpenAI and provided much of the computing infrastructure used by the company, was also confronted with the sudden change in leadership. Despite the enormous commercial relationship between the two organizations, Microsoft did not control OpenAI's board. The unusual governance structure established years earlier meant that the authority to remove the chief executive ultimately rested with the directors of the nonprofit organization. On November 17th, they had exercised that authority. What they had not anticipated was how the rest of the company would respond. Over the following day, discussions began over whether Altman might return. OpenAI's leadership, employees, and investors were now attempting to understand both the reasons for his removal and what would happen next. The board, meanwhile, remained responsible for selecting the company's leadership. By Sunday, November 19th, negotiations had not resulted in Altman's reinstatement. Instead, OpenAI announced another change. Mira Murati, who had served as interim chief executive for only a short period, would be replaced by Emmett Shear, the former chief executive of Twitch. Shear would become OpenAI's second interim CEO in the space of a single weekend. At roughly the same time, another development fundamentally changed the situation. Microsoft announced that Sam Altman and Greg Brockman would join the company to lead a new advanced artificial intelligence research team. For Microsoft, the arrangement offered a way to retain access to people who had been central to OpenAI's development, even if they no longer worked for OpenAI itself. For OpenAI's employees, however, the announcement created another possibility. If Altman and Brockman could move to Microsoft, they could potentially follow them. By Monday morning, what had begun as the removal of one chief executive was developing into a much larger problem for the organization. On Monday, November 20th, hundreds of OpenAI employees signed a letter addressed to the company's board. The employees argued that the process used to remove Altman and Brockman had endangered the company, and they called for the directors to resign and for Altman and Brockman to be reinstated. The letter also stated that the employees could leave OpenAI and join the newly announced Microsoft operation if those changes did not occur. The threat was particularly serious because OpenAI's value depended heavily on a relatively concentrated group of researchers, engineers, and technical staff. Losing a substantial portion of them could have made it considerably more difficult for the company to continue developing its models and products. One of the names associated with the employee opposition was particularly significant. Ilya Sutskever, OpenAI's chief scientist and one of the board members involved in Altman's removal, publicly expressed regret over his participation in the board's actions. The internal balance was changing. Microsoft had offered Altman and Brockman somewhere to go. Employees had demonstrated that many of them were prepared to follow. And the board now faced the possibility of retaining formal control over an organization while losing a substantial part of the workforce required to operate it. Less than 3 days after Altman's dismissal, the question was no longer simply who should serve as OpenAI's chief executive. It was whether the organization created around its unusual governance structure could remain intact. Negotiations continued into Tuesday. Then, shortly after midnight in San Francisco on November 22nd, OpenAI announced that an agreement had been reached in principle for Sam Altman to return as chief executive. The arrangement also brought significant changes to the board itself. Brett Taylor, the former co-chief executive of Salesforce, would become chairman. Former United States Treasury Secretary Larry Summers would join him, while Adam D'Angelo would remain from the previous board. Altman returned to the company, and Greg Brockman would also return. Mira Marathi resumed her position as Chief Technology Officer. In less than 5 days, OpenAI had removed its chief executive, appointed 2 interim replacements, watched its president resign, faced the possible departure of much of its workforce, and then agreed to bring much of its previous leadership back. The board that had initiated the process had also been substantially reconstructed. OpenAI had survived the immediate crisis, but the events had exposed an important weakness in the system that had governed the organization as it grew from a research laboratory into a company with enormous commercial importance. The structure had given a small nonprofit board considerable authority. What November 2023 demonstrated was how difficult exercising that authority could become once OpenAI had employees, investors, commercial partners, and customers whose interests were closely tied to the organization. In the months following Sam Altman's return, OpenAI began examining the events that had led to his removal. In December 2023, a special committee of the company's new board appointed the law firm WilmerHale to conduct an independent review. Investigators interviewed members of the former board, company executives, advisors, and other witnesses, while examining more than 30,000 documents relating to the events surrounding Altman's dismissal. The review was completed in March 2024. It found that the decision to remove Altman had followed a breakdown in trust between him and members of the previous board. Importantly, the review found that the decision had not resulted from concerns about the safety or security of OpenAI's products, the speed at which its technology was being developed, the company's finances, or statements made to investors and business partners. Instead, the former board had acted after concluding that its relationship with Altman had become increasingly difficult to manage. The review also found that the board had acted within its authority when removing him, but had done so on an abbreviated timetable, without providing advance notice to several important stakeholders, and without giving Altman an opportunity to respond fully to its concerns. His conduct, the review concluded, did not require his removal. Following the findings, OpenAI's new board expressed confidence in Altman and Greg Brockman continuing to lead the company. Altman also returned to the board, which was expanded with additional directors. OpenAI introduced new corporate governance guidelines, strengthened its conflict of interest policy, established a whistleblower hotline, and created additional board committees. The governance structure at the center of the crisis would continue to evolve. In October 2025, OpenAI completed a broader restructuring. Its nonprofit became the OpenAI Foundation, while its commercial operation became OpenAI Group PBC, a public benefit corporation. The foundation retained control of the commercial company while also receiving an equity stake in it, preserving the principle that had existed since OpenAI first introduced a commercial subsidiary in 2019. The organization responsible for OpenAI's mission would ultimately retain control over the business. The events of November 2023 had lasted less than a week, but they demonstrated how consequential that unusual arrangement could become when the interests of a nonprofit board, company leadership, employees, and major investors no longer moved in the same direction.